And welcome back. As we go ahead and continue looking at classes, we're now going to go ahead and discuss accessor and mutator methods. So let's start first with accessor methods. If you recall, we talked about how we should always make our instant variables private. However, what if we need to do something with the data in the class? So for example, let's say we have an instance variable for name and we need to change what that name is. Well, we can't access the variable directly, so how can we do that? Well, we have special purpose methods that exist, such as things like toString and equals, and any input methods allow us to do new things with data, right? So we've seen this. However, we may encounter wanting to do something with the data for which there is no special purpose method. And so then how can we do anything with the data that's in that object? Well, provided that we equip our class with the appropriate accessor and mutator methods, we can then access and change the data in an object. So the accessor methods are what allow us to obtain that data that we want to change. So for example, we look at the date5try class that we explored last time. The methods getMonth, getDay, and getYear are what we call accessor methods. The accessor methods do not literally return the values of each instance variable, but they must return something equivalent to those values. GetMonth, for example, will return the number that is associated with that month, even though it is stored as a string instance variable. Now generally, the key thing to note is that all accessor methods are going to start with the phrase get. And this is very important because it's an easy way for us to distinguish, hey, this is an accessor method. We're trying to get information, and so that's why we tend to use that. The next type, of course, are mutator methods. And you might already be figuring out what these are going to do and what role they're going to purpose. So the purpose of these guys allows us to change the data in the class objects. Accessors simply retrieve it. Mutators allow us to change it. And in the date5try class, these are the methods whose names start with the key set. All mutator words generally use that same kind of thing. We're going to set the value of something. So setting the name, setting the age, setting the whole object, Therefore, our class definitions should provide a complete set of public accessor methods and at least some public mutator methods, depending on what we want to give access to. Now, there are some important classes, such as string, that have no public mutator methods, and there's reasons for that. Now, let's spiral it back just a little bit to talk about our private instance variables. At first, it may seem that accessor and mutator methods defeat our whole purpose of having private instance variables, because now we can find these values and we can change it. Before, we didn't want you to be able to change it. Well, there is a reason for that. If we kind of look at how date5try is working, it allows us to see that these methods are not equivalent to making the instance variables public. Instead, what they do, they all test, for example, an illegal date and end the program with an error if there's an attempt to set it to any illegal value. So it has, of course, some restrictions on what is actually passed in. Now, if these were public, well, then you could set a date such as January 42nd, 1930. Notice, 42nd is not a date that we're used to seeing, but because we can pass it through this method, it allows us to kind of filter this for like invalid entries, all handled within the class, rather than having the user have to handle that on their end. Now, a class has access to pretty much private members of all objects of the class. And what does this mean? Well, if we look at the method of date5try, let's say our equals method, and of course we're going to return a value here to see if like month is equal to date and stuff like that. Well, if we think about how this Boolean expression works, you may think that other date.month, other date.day, and other date.year are illegal because month, day, and year are private instance variables. Because I can't go to my main class and call date.month because it's going to give me an error. I can't do a date.day or a date.year. But why can we do it here? Well, normally you would think this, and this would be correct. However, the object, other date, is of the same type as the class being defined, and because it's the same type as that class being defined, we can do this, and so therefore it's completely legal and permitted for us to be able to do. Now, if we talk about these private definitions a little bit more, if we look inside of a class and these private definitions, we can access private members of any object of the class, just not the members that are of the calling object. Similar remarks, of course, can apply to the methods precedes in the same class. So if we look at our precedes method, it has a similar approach. Now, in one place of the definition of that method, we, of course, use the otherDate.month rather than otherDate.month with no parentheses, only because we want the month as an integer rather than as a string. So if you take a look at the date5try class and we look at precedes, you'll take a notice for that. And again, it's because we're looking for a specific value to be able to use. So in our definition of date5try, you'll also notice that our mutator methods are tested to see if the values for the instance variables are sensible. All right, as we are solved, like January 42nd. Like there is no such date as January 42nd. Because if they aren't sensible values, well, the mutator methods terminate the program and then issue an error message. Now, all this is, of course, building into something known as the principle of encapsulation. So if we actually look at the encapsulation of class, you'll see that there's pretty much two kind of pieces that we have to work on. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about like driver classes. But here we have effectively, this is our class, so this would be like our date5try. And inside of that date5try class, you'll see there's two different pieces. We have information, that is the implementation details hidden, all right, such as our private instance variables, any private constants, private methods, the bodies of the public and private method definition. Now, you can't necessarily see what the exact code is, even though we can access the method, we don't know what the implementation details are. Also, we have an interface that therefore is available to the programmer using the classes. And what does the interface typically look like? Well, we can have things like comments that will be able to provide insight into how to use, for example, certain methods. We have headings of like Accessor, Mutator, and other methods, and public defined constants that let the user know, like, hey, this is this Mutator class, and it's going to allow you to change the name of the calling object. On the flip side, we have this small standalone that says programmer who uses class. This, of course, is going to manifest typically in our driver classes, our main, our demo. This is where this is going to happen, and what they're going to do is they're going to use those things that are available to them to be able to see, to be able to implement code that takes care of the hidden details. Because you notice this arrow doesn't directly point here to the hidden area, and that's because, again, the programmer who uses the class can only interact with the interface that's available. And just remember, a class definition should have no public instance variables. All right. Very rarely are you going to have any kind of public instance variable, and because you notice that they are private. We want to keep those instance variables restricted in access, because the programmer who's using the class technically should not necessarily need these if you've set up your code correctly with the appropriate get or set methods. And over here in Eclipse, again, we can take a look at some of these methods. Of course, here is our setDate method, which allows us to set the date to a month, day, and year. Notice it is an integer value here, even though our instance variable is a string. And that's because it's going to invoke the month string method. If we look further down, we, of course, have the setMonth method here, which, of course, is taking a symbol in parameter. And you'll notice, again, with these, they're using the date OK, or we're doing some kind of Boolean test to make sure that the values that are being entered or passed into these methods are correct. Same thing here with setDay, setYear. Again, we're checking to make sure we have valid entries entered in here. Now, what about these, private and public? We've talked about a lot of these. Let's just go ahead and use some of this. So I went ahead and created a quick demo, and you have date.readInput, because date.readInput, of course, is a public class. So we look over at date.readInput, it is a public class. As we already know, if I try to call date.month, for example, of course, we get an error. Now, it did try to convert that over here, so let me just change it back, date.month. All right, we can't use that, right? Because month is a private variable. However, if I want to use that, let's say date.getMonth, now I can have a value that we can retrieve. Now, I would have to set that to something, so maybe like string a month equals date.getMonth. All right. Now, of course, it's still like, oh, I don't know what to do. It's saying, look, it's returning a integer value. So we, of course, would have to convert this over. So let's just say int a month equals date a month. There we go. So that works. And then of course we could do things. I could print it out. I could do things with it. Or maybe I want to change that value. All right, if I want to change the value of that, so let's do date dot set. Let's just do the set month, and let's just go ahead and change it to October. All right. Now you notice it's again giving me an error, so I'm going to check this. It says, oh, again, I have an int. So one thing to keep in mind is when you start using these methods to make sure you're using the correct parameter. So let's just go ahead and make that not October. Let's make that 10 then. And then let's just go ahead and output that. So we'll just say system.out.println date. And if we give that a quick run, the program should, of course, ask us to enter our input because you notice that is the very first thing that we're invoking here. And so let's go ahead and enter in some values here. So let's go ahead and do 1, how about 16, and how about 1954. And you can see it changes it to October 16, 1954. Because again, we are passing in this as a value here, and that allows us to easily use it. Now, of course, we're not using a month here. You can see it's saying this variable is not being used, but it's a quick way for us just to see how we can use things like get month and set month in our program to be able to use these things that would normally be restricted to us, because again, remember, we cannot access these variables directly, so instead we have to use these get and set methods to be able to use these pieces of our program.